So, good afternoon from London, but we have a very global audience today. So, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are joining us from today. And welcome to this webinar on shedding light on dark money, how governments can tackle illicit finance. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former UK civil servant. I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum. They're a publishing house that serves civil servants all around the world, and with our knowledge partner today, that's Deloitte. So in terms of today's topic, very topical this webinar. So governments around the world are missing out on billions of dollars of revenue that would otherwise be able to fund vital public services. Global events from the coronavirus pandemic to Russia's invasion of Ukraine have really moved the issues of tackling corruption, fraud and money laundering right up the political agenda. And at a time when governments are facing difficult fiscal constraints, tackling this flow of dark money has never been more vital. A need for action is not just financial. Tackling the flow of dirty money in an economy also helps to prevent crime, making it tougher for criminals to spend their ill-gotten gains. So in today's webinar, we're going to be discussing what plans countries have in place to address fraud and illicit finance, and how governments, the public and the private sectors can all work together globally to tackle these serious issues. We have a fantastic, really fantastic expert panel with us here today. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce our panelists and invite them to say some opening remarks. But actually, there will also be an opportunity for you, our audience, to put your questions to this expert panel. So once they have all spoken, we'll get through as many of those questions as we can. On whichever device you are using today, you'll probably see a Q&A button, a Q&A function somewhere. At any point from now on, please use that Q&A function to message in your questions. And as I say, once we've heard from our panel, we will then turn to the audience questions. So in terms of our fantastic panel, first we will hear from Barry McKillop, who is the Deputy Director of Intelligence at the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada, FinTrack. Barry has extensive experience in developing and implementing anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing compliance programs and policies. Prior to this, he worked at Public Safety Canada, where he held a variety of senior positions, including Director General of Law Enforcement, Organised Crime and Border Strategies, and Director of Summit Security, Contract Leasing and Firearms Policy. Then we will hear from Chris Bostock, who is Director of the Financial Crime Team at Deloitte, and he coordinates the firm's thought leadership on key financial crime issues, including asset recovery, transparency of financial ownership, and improving the effectiveness of the financial crime framework through innovations including public-private partnerships and information sharing utilities. Chris joined Deloitte after 17 years with the UK National Crime Agency, where he was National Threat Lead for Money Laundering and where he established and led the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, so has both that public and private sector experience. Then we'll hear from Brenda McVeigh. Brenda is head of the Anti-Money Laundering and Sanctions Unit in the Department of Finance in Ireland. She has responsibility for the negotiations between EU partners for the new anti-money laundering and countering the funding of terrorism package, which includes proposals for a new rulebook and a new authority. Brenda has worked across numerous legislative portfolios in the Department of Finance, and specifically she developed Ireland's framework for identification and management of its dormant assets and led the Irish delegation during its EU presidency, dealing with EU proposals for a financial transaction tax. Then we'll hear from Daniel Eriksson, who is the CEO of Transparency International Secretariat in Berlin. Daniel has worked in both the private and not-for-profit sectors, including for the Swedish government, the United Nations, the European Commission, civil society organizations, and more. His role as a military peacekeeper in the former Yugoslavia and subsequent work in sustainable development in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East redirected his focus towards corruption as an obstacle to human development. So he's a really strong believer in the role of technology, for example, in global efforts to end corruption. And then last but by no means least, we'll hear from Laura Eshelby, who is Deputy Director for Practice, Standards and Capability at the Public Sector Fraud Authority in the Cabinet Office here in the United Kingdom. The authority works with departments and public bodies to reduce the impact of fraud, including by increasing capability in counter fraud by developing the counter fraud profession. Laura started her career as an auditor in the Legal Aid Agency at the Ministry of Justice. She trained as a financial investigator, acquiring a skill set in counter fraud, and most recently, she has led on the oversight of post-event assurance, supporting the aims of understanding the losses arising during COVID-19. So I'm sure you'll agree with me. As I said before, we really do have a stellar panel with us here today. Please do take this opportunity to message in any questions that you have had on the topic of how governments can tackle illicit finance. But now I am going to invite Barry to give us the first opening remarks. Over to you, Barry. Just got to come off mute there.
There you go.
For it. Thanks, Barry.
As I said, we're getting back to pre-COVID times, so I'm losing my touch on the computers. But first of all, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity that the Global Government Forum is giving us to speak today. I think you touched on a couple of things. First of all, the international nature of this panel, I think, really does reflect the global challenges that we have. Money laundering, as you know, it's a global issue. It takes a global approach. There is no single approach, and I hope nobody's on this webinar hoping for a magic bullet answer, because that doesn't exist, unfortunately. No single approach works for all. We can't simply take what we have in Canada, for example, and export it and expect it to be put in place and be as effective somewhere else as it may be in Canada or any other country approach. I really think that we have to respect country laws, their own approaches, their own priorities in some cases. Intelligence priorities, for example, can differ from country to country. But I think ideally what we need to do is we do need to work together. We need to learn from each other. I've certainly seen it through some of the work we've done with the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime. The opportunity to put forward best practices, to show what works in some countries, and to be able to take components of other approaches from other countries and really make them your own and make them work. It really is, if everybody focuses on the same goal, I think how we get there may be different, but I think if we're going there together, we may actually have an impact globally on these issues. In Canada, one of our, I guess, preferred approaches, if I look at it from an FIU approach, is our public-private partnerships. We really do see and have seen not only an impact, but an ongoing benefit, and it really has been something that has led the way for many, many others. Our first one, our flagship one, for example, was Project Protect. People may know of this project. It is a public-private partnership that was launched really from a discussion and a challenge from Timea Nagy, who is a survivor of human trafficking, and she challenged us to use financial intelligence, for example, to address human trafficking in Canada as well as globally. From there, FinTrack produced an operation alert, working with Timea, other NGOs, law enforcement, our major financial institutions, our large money service businesses as well. And we came together, we looked at what kind of reporting have we had so far at FinTrack, what are the suspicious transactions that we've seen, and from there we generated and validated a number of very actionable financial indicators that can be used by our reporting entities to actually find human trafficking within their own institutions. So we could see the money movement within institutions. They could report it to FinTrack, and FinTrack could then pull together all those reports, create actionable financial intelligence disclosures to law enforcement, and then we disclose those to law enforcement in Canada or internationally through our Egmont group. And then we can, from there, address and attack the human trafficking component. What we've seen actually with that is that I think prior to 2016, when we launched the initial Project Protect, we had done about 40 or so disclosures in 16 years actually at FinTrack. Since 2016, we've done over 1,500 financial disclosures on human trafficking. The good side of that is that it is working. The reporting that's coming in is of high quality, high quantity. We've seen over 500% increase in suspicious transactions. The bad thing is that we've actually shed light on a very significant problem in Canada, which is human trafficking. What I found with our PPPs is that when you develop these indicators and you actually assist and work with the regulator as well as the FIU and your reporting entities, when you assist them in developing the right algorithms, the right indicators to look for, the right transactions to look for, they actually find them. So we are finding them. They were there before. They just weren't perhaps being looked for in the right way. And the PPPs have really shown to be beneficial. Project Protect has given rise to Project Guardian, which looks at fentanyl trafficking, Project Chameleon, which is romance scams, Project Athena, which is underground banking, Project Shadow, which is child sexual exploitation on the internet. Our most recent one was Project Legion, which is looking at the illicit cannabis market. And as we develop these indicators, as the reporting entities put them into place, we are finding an immediate increase in reporting. So once you start looking for things, they will find them. It's also given rise to the possibility of looking at something aspirational. Project Vigil, for example, is right now very aspirational. It's looking at, is there a way of leveraging existing infrastructure like a real-time payment system with Payments Canada to actually put algorithms on there and identify even sooner for reporting entities, for financial institutions, those transactions that may be linked across banks or across reporting institutions so that they can actually find these transactions quicker, look at some of their know your client type information that they have, and file reports to FinTrack even quicker. We're looking at whether or not we can use that type of approach in Canada. As I said, it is aspirational at this point, but we're looking at whether or not we can use that type of approach. Focused specifically right now on human trafficking and child sexual exploitation on the internet, because those are extremely heinous crimes, and we're looking at addressing those first to see if we can do a proof of concept that would work, and whether or not we could help identify those transactions quicker, and therefore identify victims quicker, and hopefully they will become survivors quicker, and we can move them back into the financial system after that. So that really is the approach that we're taking in Canada. I think the other approach that we can take and that we are moving towards as well is concepts of international PPPs. We've done them in Canada. All our PPPs in Canada are Canada focused right now with our reporting entities, but we're looking at whether or not we can do an international PPP where we have several countries, several banks in several countries, all working on similar indicators with the same goal of addressing the similar or the same predicate crime to money laundering. And if we're all working together with very, very similar approaches and similar indicators, I think that we may, and I'm hoping that we will have a significant impact on that particular crime. And I won't scoop myself on which one it is, but we'll talk about that as we go on. So I know that my time is just about up, so I will turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Barry. Thank you so much. I mean, a brilliant way to kick off there, because I think you set some really good principles, which I think others will relate to. So this is a global issue, as you said at the start, needs a global approach, but actually each country within that has to have its bespoke approach, but still work with others. And then really stressing that the effectiveness of the public-private partnerships there, really interesting, the example you gave of starting with using financial transactions to identify the scale of the issue around human trafficking, and then the aspiration to do it much quicker using the real-time payment system, and also then the aspiration to go more international with those public-private partnerships. Thank you so much, Barry. Great way to kick off. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, and thank you to Global Government Forum for having me here. As was mentioned at the outset, I'll be drawing on sort of reflections of my time both in law enforcement, but also since joining Deloitte on working with the Home Office and others around AML reform, and indeed some of the white papers that I've drafted over the years with the International Institute of Finance as well. First, I thought it would be worth just setting the context a little bit. I'm still shocked and surprised and saddened that I still meet people who say economic crime or financial crime is victimless, which it clearly isn't. It enables criminals to profit from the most heinous crimes, causes immense financial human cost to individuals, government, and wider society. Secondly, the scale of the threat is also worth pausing on. The statistics paint a frightening picture. I think it's something around 2 trillion a year. The estimates vary around money laundering, money that's laundered globally. Bribery and corruption is estimated to be somewhere around the 5% of global GDP. Wildlife trafficking, 15 billion, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the COVID frauds and the issues in Ukraine have amplified the scale of the threat further. And the third point I would make in this sort of scene setting element is that despite the fact that stakeholders on the public and the private sector side spend trillions of dollars trying to confront and tackle illicit finance, the outcomes at the moment, sadly, represent a collective failure. I think at a generous assessment, proceeds of crime recovered are around the kind of 1% mark. In the UK, at least, only 3% of fraud cases result in conviction. And there was a really interesting statement by an academic called Ronald Poll, who referenced at the AML system as being the world's least effective policy experiment. So I think there's definitely room for us all to do better. And I think if I'm saying that the system is not working as well as it might, it's worth just reflecting on why that might be. So there's sort of 5 themes here that I would identify. One is that it's a system, it's an ecosystem, but that ecosystem doesn't act as a system. To fight financial crime effectively, we need stakeholders to work together, but partnerships, which Barry mentioned, are absolutely critical, but they're sadly underdeveloped globally at the moment. And that really is important we focus on that. It's important around pace as well. Criminals can move money in the blink of an eye. It takes law enforcement weeks, days, perhaps even years if you're moving, trying to move cross-border to track those money flows. So we need to be more agile in the way that we track money flows. Again, partnerships, I think, are key to that. Information sharing, there simply isn't enough information shared between the stakeholders to allow them to be as effective as they might be in delivering their mandate. And then also capacity and capabilities as the fourth point. I don't think at the moment, law enforcement, the governments actually have enough capacity and capability to deal with the scale of the threat. And equally, where there is perhaps larger capacity in the banking sector, there's significantly more people working in financial crime in the banking sector than there are in the public sector. But that capacity isn't necessarily as effectively enabled as it might be to fight financial crime. And that's partly my final point around some of the impacts of the regulatory framework. It can be the case that the regulatory framework can lock capacity that exists in the private sector into some lower value activities that don't necessarily deliver as many outcomes against criminals as we would like. And there's often a limited ability to dial up effort where it will have a greater impact against criminals, and conversely, perhaps to dial it down in areas of lower priority. So those are some sort of strategic challenges that I think exist in the effectiveness of the system. But there's absolutely plenty of opportunity, and Barry's touched on a couple of solutions already, around what governments can do to address those issues. So I think the first thing actually to do is to sort of accept the reality that we're not winning this fight against financial crime, and that should raise political attention. It should increase the amount of resource, I think, that the governments can and should put towards this issue. I think it's also important that governments act as a system leader and are proactive in their role as leading that ecosystem in fighting financial crime. The effective financial crime framework requires a coherent approach across policymakers, law enforcement, regulators, supervisors, and the private sector. And without that clear system leader who has a hand on the tiller, it's too easy for all of those stakeholders to be working at odds with each other, and that only benefits the criminals. And I think one of the best ways that you can articulate system leadership, or sort of harness or demonstrate system leadership, is through the development of national strategies. I think the economic crime plans that you've seen recently in the UK are great examples of a jurisdiction trying to show leadership, trying to articulate a national plan. Are they perfect? No, but are they a step in the right direction? Absolutely, and definitely something that's worth other jurisdictions taking a look at. So if I'm arguing for national strategies, I guess the next obvious question is, what are the key things that should be in any one of those strategies. And I think the most fundamental one, which Barry's already touched on, is information sharing. And I mean information sharing in all ways, public to public, public to private, but also private to private. So there's lots of different ways and different stakeholders, but all need to be sharing more information more effectively with each other. And that's, firstly, I think it reflects the reality of crime. In my time in the National Crime Agency, I never encountered a criminal who said, I only operate in one bank in one country. They actively exploit and deliberately exploit the silos that exist between the stakeholders in the system. And the second one is around capacity. The biggest, as I've mentioned, army of financial crime fighters that there is in the private sector. Single banks can have more people in the United Kingdom, for example, than the National Crime Agency has officers in their entirety. I mean, banks, just their financial crime teams can be bigger than the entire National Crime Agency. So we need to make sure that capacity is effectively pointed at where it can have the greatest impact. So what does that mean around sharing in practice? So I think formalized public-private partnerships, as Barry mentioned, are absolutely critical here. Canada's made great steps. We've got the Gimlet in the UK, but the Fintel Alliance in Australia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of those public-private partnerships are different, but they're all tailored to local circumstances and local risk appetites, and they're all a great start. They all help to build trust. They all help to enable both tactical and strategic information sharing, and also to start collaborating on policy development as well. But that, I think, is generally quite, I suppose, analog, and we need to some extent a more digital approach. And I think you've seen some really interesting innovations, for example, Transaction Monitoring Netherlands, which is taking that public-private partnership concept, and it's making it slightly more industrial and more digital, finding more automated ways to bring different stakeholders' data sets together, to be able to see patterns, to be able to detect crime more efficiently, more effectively, to have greater outcomes against criminals. And I think that should be our North Star for all of us involved in fighting financial crime, is that whatever we do should be having an impact in delivering outcomes against criminals. I guess, noting the time, that's probably a reasonable place to pause. I'll just mention technology, absolutely critical here. The pace point I mentioned earlier, without bringing enabling technology and bringing technology to bear in the fight against financial crime, we will never keep pace with the criminals. I've mentioned funding and effectively resourcing the law enforcement capabilities to tackle asset recovery. That's critical. And the final point I'll land on is, unlike other crime types, it's important to remember that in relation to financial crime, almost all of the data that you need to fight financial crime effectively is in the hands of the good guys. It's in the hands of the banks or the law enforcement or the insurance companies. All we need to do is find the mechanisms to bring it together to have a more effective impact against criminals. And I'll pause there and hand back to you.
Thanks so much, Chris. I mean, loads to unpick there, but really good you set out that big picture with the huge scale of this. So $3 trillion, I think you're saying, lots of other statistics there, but this does matter. You know, there are real victims associated with a lot of these crimes, with all of this crime. But as you mentioned, picking up on what Barry said, you know, the system isn't working for lots of reasons. The kind of tackling this is not working. Needs to be better information sharing, breaking down those silos across all of the stakeholders, across the public and private sectors, building capacity, which I'm sure Laura will touch on when we come to her, building the capacity and the capability to deal with this. And then interesting that you brought in at the end as well, kind of the role of digital and the role of automation and technology, because I think that might be something that the audience is interested in as well. So loads to unpick there. Just to say to the audience, Chris might disappear for a second or switch devices in a moment, because there is going to be a fire alarm in his office, so he might have to go mobile for a little while on us, so don't worry if that happens. Thanks so much, Chris. Over to you now, Brenda. Brenda, we've got to take you off mute as well.
Sorry, there's technology giving up on me already.
No problem.
Thanks, Siobhan, and thanks to the forum as well. Look, the other speakers have been very eloquent about this, and I'm only going to be, I suppose, building on what they've said already, and they are more eloquent than me, but actually, given the scale of the problem, I am actually going to work up a little bit of a script here, whereas they seem to be able to speak off the cuff. But I think the very fact that I need a script indicates, just as I said, what we tackle in government, which is the sheer breadth of this problem. I'm coming at it from the the point of view of a central government department, which is possibly a slightly different lens then to some of these guys that are involved in the day-to-day operations and day-to-day law enforcement, etc. So obviously in terms of a central government department and our main agencies, traditionally our role has been providing a legislative framework based on stakeholder input, obviously, and evidence to underpin that tries to underpin a fit for purpose sort of supervision and regulatory and compliance system to tackle money laundering. But I think also increasingly, I mean, with the way in which it's moving and the breadth of the crimes that we're now trying to tackle, more and more importantly for governments now in terms of providing that leadership element that was just mentioned, we try to provide the forums for discussion and collaboration between the public and the private sector in terms of, again, trying to gather the evidence and trying to get what is needed in terms of statistics to help formulate policy proposals domestically, and then also to help us with implementing our EU and FATF, because obviously we're an EU member state, our EU and FATF obligations also. So I think where governments provide that leadership is in that collaborative piece, because as I said, we do not get involved in day-to-day operations, we don't get involved in day-to-day supervision or regulation, and it's appropriate obviously that we don't. But what we can usefully provide is the investment, and sometimes at the moment we're looking at this in terms of even like university level investment in skills and training for those that are at the coalface of dealing with money laundering, and I think that's critical at this point in time. And no small part of that is in helping those institutions to develop the training and education networks that they need and skills to provide the appropriate technology for issues such as KYC. I think governments also increasingly have to invest in agencies that are tasked with asset training and tracing, and vitally asset seizure, because I mean sometimes we're very good at sort of following the money. Actually grabbing the process of crime is a whole different ballgame. So we also are increasingly looking at the need to provide a more appropriate punitive framework to make money laundering as unattractive and difficult as possible for criminals. But the fact that we're not involved in the day-to-day supervision and sort of compliance measures that are there, I think that's sometimes what puts governments on back foot, because kind of what Chris just mentioned there, we can't be quick enough sometimes to act because we're not there in the middle of the operations, in terms of money laundering. So we are always coming at it sort of after the event and trying to like plug holes all the time as opposed to getting ahead of the money laundering problem. And I don't think that's a problem that we're going to solve very quickly, if at all. To talk about specifically some issues in Ireland then, or some measures that we're taking, we've tried to get more agile about some of these macro issues by establishing a government level AML steering committee, which is effectively a PPP between departments, government agencies and the private sector. It includes representatives from our central bank, our FIU, revenue, the self-regulatory bodies as well. But currently, because we fully embraced this need to take a risk-based rather than a rules-based approach to tackling money laundering, and I think that is an issue that we should, I think we're sometimes veering a little bit these days more towards that rules-based approach, which I don't think is the right thing to do. But anyway, we, even with our resource problems, we have found that, that steering committee's best way of operating now is to look at very specific projects where we need the outcomes to be initially recommendations to government for policy responses. We're working on 4 specific projects at the moment, but as the other speakers have touched on already, one of the big ones for us is the information sharing initiative, coupled with trying to do better in relation to statistics gathering and statistics analysis. And I'll be interested to hear from some of the UK speakers today on aspects of that. We want to look at the private to private, the public to private, etc., information sharing, and how we can get serious about that while not falling foul of GDPR and privacy rights issues, which always are walls that we come up against whenever we're dealing with money laundering matters. Maybe just in the EU, I'm not sure, but generally anyway. I mean, we've done a lot of groundwork this year on that information sharing project, and there's certainly a cross-government sense that if we do something in the information sharing space, that's going to be a real game changer. But you all know it's not that simple. And we hope early in 2023 to work on a sandbox initiative with some of the banks, our central bank and our Data Protection Commission. We want this to be a space in which we can explore more efforts to disrupt money laundering. And we've had very useful insights from FATF colleagues, including, Canada, Australia, guys like that are on, some of them are on this call. And we'll be speaking with some we've already spoken with some EU member state counterparts and to get their experience of similar initiatives. And they've been very helpful also. Because an issue in the EU when it comes to the urgent need to improve transparency in relation to AML matters is that ever-present GDPR issue. And that's the one that we struggle with almost on a daily basis in all matters ML. I've long been of the view, and I've aired this at BADF, that actually governments collectively need to consider whether GDPR rules need to bend around AML systems rather than what has been the case to date, where AML development and AML policy initiatives all seem to be trying to like work around GDPR. Now, I just think that's a little bit backward, but I do think governments globally will need to address that collectively. We can't do it in isolation. I think tackling a crime should always take precedence over protecting a criminal's data protection, privacy rights. But again, as I said, that needs collective government decision making. In relation, that also looms very large as a consideration in the new EU AML package, which is accelerating right now towards finalisation. Trilogues have begun on aspects of it, and the new EU supervisor, which we call it AMLA, is due to be established in Q1 of 2023. I think much of the package is to be welcomed, such as the move to a more coordinated and consistent supervision of the riskiest financial obliged entities across the EU. And I think also the fact that AMLA itself will be tasked with providing guidance and RTSs to obliged entities and to supervisors, etc., is a good thing, because then we will get a more harmonised approach, which is needed. You know, we need that cross-border and harmonised approach to deal with money laundering. But it's a huge package, and I think aspects of it have been very rushed. And I think there would have been a benefit in trying to isolate out parts of the draft for separate and more focused consideration. And what springs to mind immediately are provisions relating to beneficial ownership, actually, which I'm sure is a very big one for all of us today in terms of this shining a light on illicit funds. I think the use of trust structures and the new Boris interconnection of beneficial ownership systems, and also issues around crypto transfers and crypto transfer platforms. All of those things I think really should have been dealt with in a very focused and very isolated way in relation to the negotiations in this package. But it's been a top priority for the EU, so the rush to get it done is not unexpected, but I think we may yet have to revisit some of those issues. The conversation around crypto assets and the platforms that facilitate their exchange is a case in point in relation to this haste, though, and we propose certainly a more focused consideration of what is really needed. What are the real risks? What are the really concerning, who are the really concerning players? What are the assets that might warrant more attention from a money laundering perspective? But unfortunately, I think it's a sector that seems to have been demonized somewhat, to be honest. And I think most member states just wanted to crack down on the use of such assets. The Irish government suggested that the tighter you squeeze this sector in terms of supervision and regulation, actually the more likely you are to drive a lot of this activity underground, which is what we really wanted to avoid. And we felt that, again, maybe that risk-based approach has not been there in the discussion around crypto asset and crypto asset service providers. But we really advocated for that more risk-based approach. We suggested that maybe we should suck it and see for now and put the problem back actually on to the service providers and make them, responsible for proper and if you like, transparent and upstanding activities in relation to those platforms. And what we suggested in Ireland was that we say, listen, you as CASPs, the service providers, if you don't make sure that everything's properly done, that there's not money laundering going on within your systems, we are going to come back and we are going to squeeze very tight. But we felt that should have been allowed to happen first of all. Like, we should have sucked it to see where the real risks. It hasn't happened. We couldn't convince a lot of EU colleagues of that merit of sticking to a risk-based approach on this. But it remains to be seen then whether crypto transfers will now occur person to person and therefore outside the scope of supervision, which is exactly what we wanted to avoid. I think the EU package has highlighted a conflict between the EU digital strategy, which seeks to increase access to online products and assist the unbanked in the EU through the use of technology, and then the policymakers' reluctance to embrace such technology as a means to conduct, KYC and customer due diligence through areas such as, digital onboarding and the use of AI. I think there's also a mismatch between the use of digital currencies and products such as e-money cards and the difference of treatments between these products and fiat currency, even though they're essentially the same in terms of risk evaluation. So again, where criminals have the time and the money and the incentive to conduct their activities, I think it warrants a better discussion in relation to the use of technology about what governments can do to make populations more comfortable with the use of systems that are more advanced, technological systems that are more advanced in both customer ID and the tracing of assets. In my view, it's essential to establish alongside various policy initiatives such as platforms for information sharing, more education and skills training, and higher penalties to coordinate on all matters. And I know some of these speakers today have gone down that route. It's something that we are very keen to do in Ireland on matters related to AML in the financial and non-financial sectors. We've been pushing for this for some time now, and our proposals for a body that would be the go-to entity for certain defined AML functions, as well as the national competent authority for EU and UN sanctions, I think is critical. I think we're at that stage now where we certainly need that. I could get into detail, but in the time allowed, I'll just say that experience to date suggests that a silo approach is the biggest advantage we can actually give to criminals. By the time one relevant party, such as a gatekeeper, has identified an STR and then reported it to the supervisor and then tried to get to the FIU, possibly tried to get to Interpol, we look at our beneficial ownership registers, etc., the criminal has moved on. So as I said, that silo approach is actually a very big advantage for criminals, and that's why we would again think that this single body is something that's critical. But I think it's a no-brainer to me that those stakeholders need to be under one roof, so to speak, to cohesively and quickly deal with the suspicion or the occurrence of money laundering. So it would also be a significant depository for the stats needed as evidence for policy development, and would be a guidance and advisory body for gatekeepers and self-regulatory bodies. I'm still hoping this will happen in Ireland. I think it would be a very disruptive force for criminals.
Oh, I think we've lost Brenda at the end there, but just quick, she was coming to the end of her time anyway, so I'll just summarize what Brenda was saying. So again, looking at the breadth of the problem from a central government department, we focus on investing in skills, investing in technology, investing in the agencies dealing with asset seizing, for example, but reiterating a lot of what we've heard already, the need to break down silos. Sorry, Brenda, I'm just summarizing for you as we move on. So I was saying all of your focus on investment there, really interesting to hear about the Sandbox initiative that you mentioned as well. But also, I think really good that you've raised a new issue, the tension perhaps between kind of different regulatory systems there. So what you want to do on anti-money laundering, but maybe coming up against some barriers on GDPR, definitely across Europe, for example. And then also that kind of conflict of cultures maybe between wanting to use new technologies for the digital strategy in the EU, but maybe some reluctance to do that in this particular agenda when it comes to tackling illicit finance and fraud. Thank you so much, Brenda. I'm sorry you got cut off there at the end, but we can come back to anything you didn't manage to say in the questions as well. Thank you so much for all of that. Daniel, over to you.
Thanks, Siobhan, and thanks to the Global Government Forum for having me. I just arrived last night back from the International Anti-Corruption Conference, which ran over 7 days last week. It's a biannual conference that Transparency International runs. This year was the largest conference ever, with over 2,000 on-site participants and even more online. That is evidence to the interest that this topic is driving within government, corporates, and the civil society sector. As Transparency International, our approach to this topic is a mantra of three. It's for the corrupt, there should be nothing to steal, nobody to help, and nowhere to hide. That's the three areas we work on. And obviously here now, we're focusing more on the AML side of things. And I will put an emphasis on there. But one of the key outcomes from the conference last week, and listening to all of those present there, was the fact that corruption as a topic has gone from being a topic of financial inefficiency and ethics to a topic of national security. Corruption is being used as a tool by autocracies to erode and capture democracies. And they've gone beyond the trying. They're achieving this not only in the global south, but in the global north as well. This means that the need to address corruption is much... I'll wait for Chris to mute there while he's getting out with the fire alarm. Yeah. The need to address corruption is becoming much more urgent. So AML is not simply a banking and KYC issue. It's an issue to defend rule of law and democracy in the countries where the money sit. And it's obviously by nature a transnational issue. What can countries do in this regard? Of course, what has been said already here, beneficial ownership registers is a really central element in that. In general, data accessibility is really important. the European Court of Justice decision 2 weeks ago with regards to the public access to beneficial ownership registers is very interesting in this regard. That decision, I won't go into detail, but it essentially blocked public access to the registers. And building on what Brenda mentioned a moment ago, the decision of the court, the highest court in Europe, was essentially that privacy trumps the right to information. However, what I would say in this context, and me personally, I've been working on GDPR and data protection issues for many years before I joined Transparency International. The fact is, the way I interpret that ruling is that they've gone a step too far. Now, what they have done is to ensure privacy at the cost of democracy. If citizens do not have access to beneficial ownership information, there's no way for civil society and the public at large to dig in and question and investigate transactions, public procurement, whatever it might be, and democracies lose an important checks and balance element through civil society by locking them out. And this, by the way, highlights that there is still a sense amongst public institutions that corruption is a mere issue of financial inefficiency. It's a financial white-collar crime, nothing more. It is not an issue of a threat to the state as such, which it should be, and which is where we believe it's going to go towards. Obviously, just to expand a little bit of that, what do I mean by that? Strategic corruption, as we call it, is the use of corruption as a tool by Russia, China, and other autocratic players to either buy up strategic infrastructure in the countries, or to just merely fund subversive activities with dark money in democratic states, be that far-right political parties or far-left extremists in general, or QAnon-like organizations that are only there to build mistrust in democracy amongst the states where they operate. And they, both the autocracies and these subversive groups, require corruption in order to operate. Hence, why it's more critical than ever for business and banks to appropriately address this topic. Coming out of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one of the issues that we investigated was to which extent the task forces set up by the G7 actually were up to the task to address the sanctions, particularly the sanctions on oligarchs and individuals. There's actually a report published on this that Raquel can share the link to. We show that, unfortunately, the task forces requires more resources and clearer, stronger mandates for them to do their work. And there's a lot of talk and less walk amongst governments when it actually comes to implementing these sanctions effectively. We're also seeing similar issues with regards to the ability of governments in the global north to actually ensure compliance to the OECD instructions, the anti-bribery convention amongst states and across the world, but particularly in the global north. And we also have a paper on that, which we call Exporting Corruption, and there's the link for that. All in all, from our point of view as an organization with a global perspective, we have offices in about 120 countries. What we're seeing is that the world is waking up to the situation that corruption is not an issue only of the global south, but it's actually facilitated, enabled, and exported by the global north. And the global north has woken up to this situation because we in the democratic or the liberal democracies of the world are starting to realize that letting corruption get a foothold means that we get corruption into our democracies, which erode, and it can be a threat to our very existence. Yeah, we'll stop there, actually, I think, Shoban.
Thanks,
Yeah, I'm looking forward to a good discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you. Really interesting to get the perspective from Transparency International, because you're obviously a slightly different organisation from our government panelists or people, the rest of the panel members. But that real message that you're hammering home, that this is not just about the financial aspects of the crime. This is actually something that has led to undermining of the rule of law itself, and a real threat to democracy. Interesting that you give the very topical example from Ukraine of how the kind of G7 task force wasn't really resourced or didn't have the capacity and the capability to actually bring in the sanctions effectively and as quickly as they would have wanted to. And then reiterating some of those other issues around the need for people to work together, but also to focus on the enablers of this, not just the people directly doing the crime itself. Thank you so much, Daniel. And then last, but by no means least, we will come to Laura, but just to say thank you to the audience for sending in questions already. Please do keep them coming. We'll be coming straight over to the questions after Laura. Over to you, Laura.
Great, thank you. And hopefully you can hear me okay.
Great, yeah.
Great. I think I'm going to give a slightly different perspective than some of the other speakers, given, I suppose, a unique position and very new authority that I'm going to speak on behalf of today. And I suppose also the fact that I focus on practice and capability. So I'll tell you a bit more about that and how it kind of relates to the earlier speakers. Another thing to mention, I suppose, we've heard lots of different kind of elements of criminality mentioned today, from money laundering, corruption, fraud. I'll use fraud as a kind of shorthand really to cover fraud, bribery and corruption, but I'm very aware of the damage that our close cousin money laundering, one of the vehicles that's used to transfer and conceal the benefits of crime, has, but I'll kind of use that term quite globally. So if we move on in the slides, thanks. And the next one. Yeah, so I think it's always helpful when talking about, so I'm talking about the public sector, and many of our other speakers have a much broader view of a kind of that their jurisdiction or country view, and their remit might cover fraud against the public in industry as well. But I'm very much coming from a space of, what do we know about the public sector and the damage that is done by criminality to the huge billions of pounds that we spend every year in the UK to support those most vulnerable in society. And really that would always be my starting point, that's at the heart of what drives us, all of us, I think, to be passionate about this, is because any criminality means that those most vulnerable don't get access to the services they most need. And that's what should drive us, and that should be at the heart of all of our conversations. So thinking about the UK particularly, what is the scale that we are dealing with? And I think having worked in this space for 20 plus years, it can become you can get desensitized to these numbers. But I think in the current challenging fiscal context we operate in, we really should try and really hone in on the numbers and get some perspective on how much good this could do if it was not in the hands of criminals again. So we've spent a lot of time, a good few years, in the predecessor to the Public Sector Fraud Authority, which was the Centre of Expertise in the Cabinet Office, measuring and going out and working with departments in the UK to really understand the fraud problem. And it's key that we understand the nature of fraud and especially corruption. They are hidden crimes by nature. They are very different to other criminality crime types. So you really have to invest, as we've heard from our other speakers, around the right tools and capability to really dig it out. It's not there waiting for us. If we think that, then we are 20 years behind in our approach. So it really does need that investment, again, we've heard today several times, to get the investment in the tools, the resources, and the ability to eke out the data that we need to find it. So our measurement exercises over the past few years lead us to believe at the moment the minimum loss in the UK just for the public sector, so notwithstanding losses to industry, is around 33 billion pounds, which is absolutely huge. We think you can add to that from COVID, and money is still being quantified in terms of losses, so we won't know more until next year and beyond. But at the moment, we think it's around 13 billion. It very likely will be more that we've lost. You can add to that for COVID losses. If we move on. We were kind of lucky or unlucky, I'm not sure how to frame it really, going into COVID-19 within the UK, because we had already established a Five Eyes partnership. We've heard today fraud, money laundering, corruption, they operate now on a global scale, and part of the solution is about how we work together globally to tackle it. We'd definitely endorse that from the Public Sector Fraud Authority perspective. And back in 2018, we established a Five Eyes partnership with like-minded public sector organisations and law enforcement. And just before COVID hit, we established, and it's available on Gov.uk, Managing Fraud in Emergency Situation toolkit, which was actually really informed by the bushfires in Australia, the hurricanes, USA, etc. And that informed us to think about Grenfell fires, which were terrible in London, to really think about how criminals very quickly mobilise and take advantage of crisis situations. And we've heard today as well from speakers around the Ukraine situation. So we really went into the COVID pandemic with this first aspect here on the left. There will be inherently a high risk of fraud. It's very likely to happen. That might sound pretty obvious in hindsight, but remember, we wrote this before COVID-19. And I think, when thinking about the current turmoil and events in Ukraine, that is what we should be thinking. Inherently, there will be fraud, there will be corruption. The question should be when, how much, and how do we respond? If we move on. So during COVID-19 in the UK, we saw criminals very quickly, as I say, using it as a hook. They used government branding, they used everything really they could think of to get hold of financial details, the members of the public's identities. I personally worked on PPE, vaccine and test fraud, which was rife. And that was another opportunity for us to work with our Five Eyes partners. Very early on, we established intelligence sharing and at one point, daily interactions to try and get on top of that. What we were able to do, as I said, is draw upon that best practice guidance. And we were also fortunate that for a number of years, we had been working to build structures such as what we term our counter fraud function, which represents 16,000 people working across government departments and agencies in the UK. So where we needed to identify at pace specialist resources and personnel, we were able to call upon that framework to draw upon. Notwithstanding that, I've already mentioned that we still suffered huge losses, and as I say, still being quantified. So if we move on. We took time out, obviously, post-pandemic to really reflect on what kind of lessons we could learn. They really have helped to inform the shape of the Public Sector Fraud Authority, which, as I said, we just launched, and I'll talk about in a moment. I won't go through all of these in the interest of time, but I'll just pull out a few there. Trusted expertise is critical. And again, for many people on this call, if you work in this space, you'll be like, well, that's really pretty obvious again, Laura. But I can tell you that during the height of the pandemic, when systems were being designed and billions of pounds was about to be expended, it was still difficult, and it's a matter of public record, so you can watch the Public Accounts Committee hearings if you're interested from the UK. They're good watching. But, it was hard to have our voice heard. So having trusted experts at the outset and having their voice heard is critical. I've mentioned about structures. There were challenges for less mature organisations to react quickly. For some organisations in UK government, they were not used to spending and being responsible for such huge sums at such pace. It was a good news story that support was mobilised very quickly to help individuals and businesses. However, as I've mentioned, the scale of losses is vast, and we are still working hard to quantify and understand the full damage that has been done. One of the key areas I'll just pull out on this one that we've really learned and baked in now to managing public money and our Treasury guidance within the UK is the need for upfront fraud risk assessment. So we have specialist guidance, we have training programs now. We've trained, I think, over 150 people in the past 18 months to 2 years on fraud risk assessment. I have ambitions this will be a destination career choice for people, not something I thought I'd ever say. You know, moving beyond investigation and making sure that people have the adequate specialists they can call upon to do this upfront at scheme design, not once the money has gone out the door or once the policy's been in place. This needs to be done upfront, and then that's baked in now to a mandated part of how government operates in the UK. Massive shift forward. So go to next. So, you know, what can we do beyond COVID? So I think I'll move on actually and use some of this to talk more about the PSFA if we move on. So taking all of those lessons learned, and I'm happy for those slides to be shared, what it's really done is informed our journey to gain investment at a significant scale within the UK. So 24 billion pound, 24 billion, I wish it was 24 million pounds, I should say, has been invested over the next 3 years and led to the launch of the Public Sector Fraud Authority just in August. And we are launched to build, so we have a lot of work ahead of us to build the service and function areas I'll come on to tell you about. That's part of an overall package, which is now standing at around 870 million pounds. That the current government has invested, and that's on top of kind of business as usual investment that happens in tax and welfare in the UK, which I think current was standing at around 600 million. So you can see that in the UK they are starting to recognise the problem. As I've said, I've worked in this area a long time, and that investment is the start, I hope, of more funding in this area. And I think it's important as well to pull out the difference between investment in tax and welfare, where there's been a known problem for some time, and therefore quite rightly investment has been made. With this new investment in business innovation skills and also in Public Sector Fraud Authority, we're starting to see a recognition that system-wide investment is needed, and not just in the areas where fraud has been detected. It's a hidden crime, remember, so we need to put money in and tools in and expertise in to seek it out. So gone are the days where we can say, well, there is no fraud there, so we don't need to invest fraud capability. Fraud capability is needed throughout the system to have a holistic response. So the PSFA kind of core approach and mission is to modernise the approach to counter fraud in the UK, and we'll do that through focusing on capability and focusing on preventing fraud. I'm sure that many of the people on the call today, some of you maybe still in tactical roles, many of you have maybe moved on to strategic roles. We can't investigate our way out of this problem, whether it's money laundering, corruption or fraud. We've heard from earlier speakers, there isn't the capacity, I should say, in law enforcement to deal with it. The outcomes in the UK that lead to criminal prosecutions and outcomes are very, very low for all sectors. So we really need to look at this new approach, putting risk at the heart of it and focusing on prevent. So the PSFA is going to focus on support services and functions, of which there are 6. And I'll just draw out a few of those now, but not go through all of them for you. So data and intelligence is at the heart of this, and we've heard that from all of the speakers today. And a key part of the investment in the PSFA will be building centralised services that departments and agencies, maybe those less mature as well, can call upon, build it once, and many users can draw upon that. We're doing lots of work at the moment on network analytics, looking to target organised crime gangs, working across, we heard public-private partnership many times today, and that's a big focus of our data analytic work. We also want to build on our centralised intelligence approach that we developed during COVID, again, working across sectors and law enforcement in the UK. And part of the response will be building a dedicated enforcement unit, an end-to-end response for those less capable and less resourced departments to be able to call upon where they're unable to get support, maybe from other agencies. We'll also have a big focus on risk, threat and prevention, and providing tiger teams and other kind of specialist support to go out and mobilise upfront to really understand the opportunity to design out and prevent fraud where possible. We've already started to test that on recent energy scheme spending across the UK government. So really what I want to get across today is we're trying to build structures for the future. This will be underpinned by legislative reform. We are out for consultation at the moment in relation to the enforcement agency, enforcement unit. So you'll be able to read more about that online. We're also...
Laura, I'm just conscious we'll have to just your final thoughts, because otherwise we're not going to have time for questions, that's all.
Oh, okay. That's absolutely fine. Okay, I'll just skip forward then. So just to mention, one of the key aims is to increase scrutiny to enhance the performance and outcomes of public sector organisations and work alongside private sector organisations to develop leading practice and guidance through the counter-fraud profession, which I won't go on to. I'll just end there.
Thanks, Laura. We can definitely come back to anything you didn't feel that you got a chance to cover. There's so much there. I know you're doing so much in the UK, but really interesting to hear your kind of analysis of just how big the issue is just for the UK public sector alone, that 33 billion figure. But really interesting to hear how you're developing through this authority that real focus on building capability, building the kind of central expertise, building those central resources, focusing on data issues, all of those things I think that have been picked up by others, but you're really putting that into practice now, learning from the lessons of COVID and building that kind of professional, the profession in the UK. So, and I think that is a world first, probably. Thank you to everybody for those brilliant opening remarks. We have had questions come in. I'm going to go straight to the questions from the audience. We have had a lot in from Jeff Coates. I'm just going to pick on a couple of the things that Jeff, I'm going to try and summarize. He's been sending a lot of reports for other people can look at, but summarize something that Jeff said, and then I'm going to ask a question that Carol Ann Taylor asked as well. And given the timing that we have now, I'm going to put two questions to you on the panel, and you can answer one or both of those questions. So I think summarizing some of what Jeff has said, he's asked about, or they've asked about the scale of kind of the front of using kind of charities or companies as fronts for some of this criminal activity, but also do we know the scale of housing? To what extent is housing being used as a kind of front for funneling dark money? So that's one question. So do we know kind of how this money is being channeled? And then the other question from Carol Ann Taylor is what controls could be applied to international transaction companies like PayPal, Apple Pay, those kind of things to limit kind of scams, so a different type of kind of fraudulent activity, but is there anything that can be done to clamp down on those kind of companies? Barry, we haven't heard from you for a while. I'm going to come back to you for your thoughts on those two questions.
Thanks, Siobhan. Good questions, and I don't know that in the last 12 minutes I could actually answer it all, and I'm not going to try to answer it. Certainly housing, real estate, is a preferred choice for money launderers. I mean, if you have money and you need a place to live, place to invest, and to flip it, especially during COVID, where a lot of people were looking to get out of condos and out of apartments and buy housing, it was a great time to buy and flip. So yes, housing remains and will always remain a preferred choice, or I guess if I was a money launderer, a good choice in terms of investing money and being able to flip it and actually make money. And if you have a complicit lawyer or a real estate firm that is willing to look the other way and not necessarily do the know your client and do the actual reporting to FinTrack or other FIUs in the world, it can be a significant problem. With respect to the PayPals, the Apple Pays, PayPal actually does report, because they do provide sort of a money service business in Canada, so they do report to FinTrack. We receive in FinTrack all international money transfers in or out of Canada over $10,000. That is not consistent across the world with FIUs. The requirement to report international EFTs is not, in fact, existent in all countries. I think if it were, that may have an impact, at least give more FIUs, more eyes on those types of reports. It certainly keeps our financial institutions, our MSBs, busy in terms of sending those reports to us, but they are automated. They do digital and they use technology to send that, but it allows us to incorporate all of those types of transactions into the disclosures we make to law enforcement. So it does, in fact, allow us to identify international links, perhaps a little easier than some other countries where the FIU does not receive those types of reports. So I think that is something, if we're looking at best practice, we have those. I know Australia receives those. That might be a best practice to learn from. So I'll let others speak to this because we don't have much time.
I'm going to ask Chris if he's there, if he can put his camera back on, if that is working, and see if he wants to comment on these two questions. I think Chris might be struggling with his. Daniel, while we're waiting for Chris, I'll come to you. Did you have anything to add to what Barry has said there?
Just to say, I was just about to share our report on corruption and real estate, which I will paste here so Rachel can do what she wants with it. But for sure, the use of non-profit foundations, the use of real estate, the use of luxury goods, I mean, I think everyone on this call knows what the bad guys are doing in order to get their money clean and move them around. And then, of course, the up and coming use of crypto, which I don't think is going to be such a game changer as many proclaim. If I was a bad guy, I would adopt according to where I want to move my money from and to, depending on the capabilities of law enforcement on each end, intelligence units on each end, and what my goals are. And we just have to be us, the good side, have to be very conscious about adapting on national level, resourcing on the relevant agencies on a national level, but also looking at transnational legislation and strengthening them so that it becomes more expensive to be corrupt.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. Well, Brenda, I want to add, I'm going to come to you on these questions, but I want to add, I mean, Daniel did throw in crypto there, and we've had a question in from Ali, who said, what's the future of crypto money laundering wise? And obviously this was something you were very focused on in your opening remarks. So your thoughts on either of those two questions, but also the future of crypto in terms of money laundering as well.
Okay, well, in relation to the first questions and the use of company structures, etc., we're certainly seeing that, or we have a sense that that is becoming more and more of an issue. I mean, the structures around the companies and trusts and all in one sort of very complex structure is proving very difficult to actually get to the beneficial owner of those very complex structures that are set up now. Trusts again have become a bit of a bogeyman because there is quite a lot of I'll call it confidentiality, others might call it secrecy around trust structures. But I think that we haven't really gotten to the solution there yet in terms of either ownership or control of those structures. So, but I think it's more to do with the complexity of the structures involved. So we're getting companies and trusts in the one group and trying to get to the bottom of that. So yeah, I think that it's been used, and we're certainly in Ireland also seeing or getting a sense of an increased use of, real estate as a front for money laundering and an awful lot of cash purchases. And when I hear things like that, and when we hear it from our FIU, that brings me right back to the gatekeepers, to the lawyers and the accountants, and where are they in this? And I think that we need to have much more robust oversight of those sectors in relation to the question that's been asked there. On crypto, obviously the new AML package involves, part of the new AML package is the new transfer of funds regulations, where all crypto transfers, well, at the moment, depending on what's actually finalized in this, all crypto transfers have to be accompanied now with information about the payer and the payee. I personally agree. I don't think crypto. I think that there's a little bit too much focus on the crypto thing for something that's been used for money laundering. I think, historically, the very scale of money laundering that has gone on today, it has all been in the sort of the regular financing areas. It's not about crypto, and we yet have to see the evidence. We hear a lot of surmising that crypto is being used for actually more so for terrorist financing. We don't actually have the evidence of that yet, and we haven't been able to get the evidence of that from across the EU. Certainly, it's been used. I don't think it's been used on the scale of regular financing yet. But I think the new transfer of funds regulations is going to be something that is going to address that. I again have that concern it's going to drive more of it actually underground rather than on our radar, which was always the problem that we tried to address in Ireland anyway.
Thanks, Brenda. Laura, I know you're talking about money laundering in particular, but your thoughts on those kind of 3 questions that have come in?
I think just quickly on the last point around crypto, really interesting to hear that the perspective there. I think the question I would ask is, what are we doing as leaders to equip people with the right skills to understand crypto? I'm really keen that we think about how we become informed consumers of those purporting to offer crypto tracing services, etc. This worries me. How can we be informed consumers if we don't understand it ourselves? And the other part to that is legislative gateways to track, trace, destroy crypto. So maybe it isn't a huge problem as maybe some of us think. I don't know. The evidence isn't there yet, but how are we skilling up and giving ourselves the legislative tools to tackle it if it becomes an issue?
Yeah, so back to that education piece as well, really important. So we've had another question come in from Sayazwan Shatri, I think, who says, since money laundering issue is a cross-border issue, technology is key for data monitoring, tracking. So not just money laundering, but we've said to tackle this, you need to be able to share data across borders, break down silos. But they've said countries might be behind with the sort of technological advancements that allow kind of that data sharing. So I guess this issue is about how do you facilitate better data sharing across countries, and in particular where some countries might not have the same kind of levels of technological infrastructure in place. Laura, I'll come to you first on this one, so you're not always the last one answering.
Yeah, I mean, I probably defer to Deloitte or one of the other speakers really, but I think the key is not to do it alone. So no sector can tackle this alone, and it is about that public-private partnership and cross-fertilization of both money and innovation is what's needed, and definitely starting to see that in certain aspects in the UK. But yeah, I'm sure some of my colleagues might have more informed view.
I'm going to again just
sorry,
quickly
Chris,
give Chris the chance.
here.
Chris,
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
yes, we can.
Apologies, sorry, I was dialing rather than join the video. So yes, on the cross-border data sharing, I mean, absolutely, that's a critical issue we need to resolve, because criminals actively exploit the fact they know that we can't share data cross-border, and they actively exploit that. So I think building on mechanisms that already exist. So, for example, the Egmont framework between FIUs is a good place to start. There's definitely more that can be done to enhance the power of and the amount of information Egmont can and do share. But I think it's also worth the PATEF and supranational policymakers continuing their focus on this topic as well. And they're not, this won't come as a surprise to them. They know they need to fix this, or they know they need to keep addressing this. So I think continuing to support the supranational policymakers to find ways to align information sharing standards cross-border is also key. And then, in the spirit of not trying to boil the ocean or trying to eat the elephant whole, I think it's also worth countries that are interested in sharing cross-border to explore what can be done amongst small groups of willing nations. So perhaps amongst the Five Eyes, perhaps amongst the G7, jurisdictions that know they have a shared appetite, a shared ethos around fighting financial crime. Let's see what we can do working bilaterally, small groups, multilaterally, to take these ideas forward. So then we have really good evidential policy basis, or really good evidence in order to inform that global policy making.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. So we're struggling a little bit with your sound, but I think we got that. Daniel, I can see, I know you have to go. I know you've got something super important to do. So thank you so much for your time. If we get any other questions for you, we've got one final question I'm going to put to the panel, but I know you have to go off now. Thank you so much for your time. And if there's anything that comes up for you, we'll send it to you separately. Thanks so much, Daniel. To the rest of the panel, just a very final and just a quick answer from you on this one. I think, and the question came in advance, and it really, you've all mentioned it actually at times in your presentations, but it's the fact that because the period we have gone through and are still going through, so the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine really has shed a light on different types of illicit finance, whether it's fraud, corruption, money laundering. What do you think the legacy will be from this period? Do you think governments are going to get the increase in resources and focus that a lot of you have called for. Brenda, I will come to you first.
Okay, well, maybe it's good that you did, because possibly I might be the pessimist in this, and you might want to end more positively. My experience, anybody that's been around government a long time knows that, a lot of crises do get wasted. And I think that, right now it's all very heightened, and we're all talking about the need to put more resources into tracing assets, into grabbing assets, into preventing criminality. My experience has been that once the crisis abates, other priorities take over. And I do think part of the problem in that is that money laundering is such a broad crime. It covers so many, if you like, individual types of crime or whatever, and it's the proceeds of crime, that it can be a little overwhelming anyway. And I think part of the problem is that at government level, you get that problem of everybody looking to somebody else to fix the problem, and everybody saying, well, no, actually that's more for your area, and that's your area, and that's your remit, or ministerial, etc. So I would be a little bit pessimistic that, both Ukraine and COVID will bring about fundamental change. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I would like to see that one legacy out of this is that because of, online crime has grown so much during this time, during the last couple of years, that we will invest more in technology, because I do think that's the real disruptor as well. And to answer the last question, we do now have this interconnected system across Europe, or we will have shortly, of Boris interconnecting the beneficial ownership registers across Europe. So, there's a recognition that technology is where to go, but I'd be a little pessimistic, just based on experience. Once the crisis is over, the heat goes out of things.
Thanks, Brenda. Laura, I'm going to come to you. I mean, are you a bit more optimistic, given that really in some ways you are the legacy from this period, aren't you?
Yeah, that might be a stretch, but yeah, I'll definitely be more positive. I share the pain though, and obviously some of us have been around this game a long time. I think what we have to do is try and be positive and think about how we can use it as a catalyst to get investment, which we're starting to see. More is always welcome. To build long-standing structures that live beyond us. So, when I talk about the profession, I talk about not building for the people that are in it now, but building for the future, making it a career of choice for people leaving school, and thinking about how we can bake things into, I know it's a bit boring, but bake things into structures, legislation.
Yeah.
That's the way that we will drive outcomes, and that's what drives more investment.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Chris, are you still there? Are you able to give us your 20 seconds on what the legacy?
Yeah, so I think sadly, if we're not careful, the heat of the bubble will shrink. What's critical to me is that we all of us who are interested in fighting financial crime ensure the focus remains on this. And I think one of the ways we can do that is absolutely building structures, as I just mentioned, but also around keeping on recognising the fact that financial crime underpins every other kind of crime. And so if we want to tackle all kinds of crime, we need to tackle financial crime. And as long as we keep that in our mind's eye, I hope we can keep it as a focus.
Great, thanks. And Barry, we started with you. I'm going to finish with you. Your thoughts on the legacy?
I won't say I'm either a pessimist or an optimist. I'll just say I'm a realist. To a certain extent, I do agree with Brenda. I do agree with everything that was said. There will be other crises, but I think, as Chris mentioned, every crisis that we see, whether it's fraud related to COVID, online crime, we've seen increase in human trafficking, child sexual exploitation, increased use of ransomware because people were using technology, the sanctions challenges that we have, and how much illegal money is invested in countries. I think it will underpin and underscore the need to invest in technology. So I am a realist there. I do think there will be investments in technology for the good guys. I think it's been recognized how quickly criminals can move, and we need to try to keep pace with them. And I think the need for information sharing and to challenge some of the privacy issues that have historically been here. I think that governments are going to get to a place where they at least want to challenge it and see how far they can push the envelope so that the good guys might have a chance to win.
Yeah, thanks so much, Barry. Well, as you say, there's a neutral place to end. I think it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I mean, it's clear that governments have a massive challenge on their hands. There's a lot being done already, but so much more to be done in terms of breaking down all those silos and getting all of the sectors working together, but all the investment in the right place as well. Thank you so much to our fantastic panel today, to Barry, to Brenda, to Chris, to Daniel, and to Laura. Thank you so much for lending us your expertise and all your time today. Thank you to the audience for sending in those great questions. I think we got through most of them. If we didn't manage to, we'll try and send you a response after the webinar. And to the audience as well, we sent out loads of links. We will make sure you get all of the resources that were mentioned today. There's also a questionnaire that's come from us. If you don't mind taking a couple of minutes to fill that in, we'd be hugely grateful. It just means we keep giving you the webinars that are most of interest to you. On that note, you'll see that on our screens there, you can join us for our next webinar, which is now after Christmas. We'll be sharing the results of research that we've done on kind of gender equality in public and civil services around the world. Thank you so much to Deloitte again for being our knowledge partner. We will circulate a link to this video so you can watch it all again. There was loads of information in there. You can watch it all again, share it with your colleagues, and we'll also be circulating an article with a write-up of the key issues from today's webinar as well. But enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are. Thank you again to our fantastic panel. I wish you all a very Merry Christmas, because I won't see you now until the new year. Wish everyone a very happy festive season, and we'll see you all again very soon. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye for now.
Thanks, Siobhan. Thank everybody.